The town of Cattle Creek had a saying, passed from porch to porch like a jug of cider. A man's worth is counted in cattle, but a woman's worth in Cattle Creek is counted in how fast she can reach the richest one. Rogar Hensley never asked to be the answer to that saying. He was 34, broad through the shoulders from a lifetime of fence work and branding irons, with a quiet way of speaking that made people lean in rather than raising his voice to be heard. 3 years back, fever had taken his wife Anna in the space of a single terrible week, and since then his daughter Beth, only 6 now, had not spoken a full sentence. She hummed sometimes, a low, wandering tune her mother used to sing over the wash basin, but words themselves seemed to have gone into the ground with Anna. Rogar owned the Circle H, the largest spread within 3 counties, 2,000 head of cattle, and a white 2-story house that caught the morning sun like it was showing off on his behalf. He hadn't built the house to show off. He'd built it because Anna wanted a nursery with a window facing east. But wealth doesn't ask permission before it becomes a rumor, and the rumor of Rogar Hensley's fortune had traveled all the way to Cheyenne, and some said even Denver. So they came. Not all at once, not admitting it outright, but they came, women in traveling dresses too fine for a cattle town, arriving under the thinnest of pretexts. A church social that required 3 trunks of luggage. A cousin's wedding that somehow always seemed to end with an extra week stay. Loretta Pierce came from Cheyenne twice that spring alone, each time finding a new reason her carriage needed repair exactly outside the Circle H gate. They performed kindness the way a peddler performs a pitch, loud, timed, and aimed. Loretta donated to the church building fund in front of a whole congregation, making sure Reverend Cole announced the amount from the pulpit. Miss Adeline Frost brought Beth a porcelain doll from Denver, cooing over the girl for exactly as long as Rogar was watching, then setting the doll aside without another glance the moment his back was turned. At the spring social, Loretta contrived to spill lemonade down the front of her dress just as Rogar passed, so that he'd have no choice but to offer his coat. He did, he was too polite not to, but his eyes more than once drifted toward the kitchen tent, where a woman in a patched blue dress was quietly wrapping cornbread in cloth. That woman was Merry Talbot, 29, unmarried, the daughter of the man who'd run Cattle Creek's only chophouse until his heart gave out 2 winters ago. Mary had kept the place running since, a leaning building with a roof that wept whenever it rained hard, a mule named Buttons who walked with a permanent limp, and a ledger so thin with debt that Mary herself often ate the burnt biscuits, so paying customers could have the good ones. She was not beautiful in the way the town gossiped about beauty. No silk, no lace, hands roughened from kneading dough before dawn, but there was something steady in her that made drifters and widows alike trust her on sight. What made Mary strange in the town's eyes was this: she never once angled toward Rogar Hensley. When he came into the chop house, she served him the same portion as anyone else, charged him the same nickel, offered no extra smile, no lingering conversation about his herd or his house. Some of the wives found this baffling, even suspicious. Every woman wants him, they said. Why not Merry Talbot? That evening at the social, while Loretta fussed with her ruined dress and Rogar's borrowed coat, nobody noticed that Beth had wandered off from her father's side. It was nearly an hour before anyone thought to look for her, and by then panic had begun to spread through the churchyard in low, worried murmurs. They found her in Mary's kitchen tent. She was not crying. She was not frightened. She was standing on an overturned crate, one small hand wrapped around a wooden spoon, stirring a pot of beans with the careful concentration of a child who had been given a real job to do. Mary stood beside her, sleeves rolled to the elbow, saying nothing extraordinary, just the ordinary, unhurried instructions a person gives when they've decided a child is worth the patience. Slow now. Round the edges. There you go. And Beth was humming, not the aimless, wandering hum she sometimes made when startled or overwhelmed. This was the tune. Anna's tune, the one from the wash basin mornings, the one Rogar hadn't heard from his daughter's lips in 3 years. He stood in the tent flap and did not trust himself to speak. Mary looked up unbothered, unaware of what she'd just witnessed. She smelled the bread, Mary said simply, as if that explained everything, and in a way to her it did. Wandered in while I was kneading. I gave her something to do with her hands so she wouldn't feel she had to talk. Roga looked at his daughter, flower on her cheek, spoon in her fist, humming her mother's song in a stranger's kitchen, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not yet have words for either. Behind him, through the tent flap, he could hear Loretta calling his name, could hear the rustle of expensive fabric hurrying toward the commotion, ready to make Beth's small disappearance into her own moment of concern and credit. But Mary didn't even glance toward the noise. She was already reaching for another spoon, already handing it to Beth's other hand, already teaching a silent child that some rooms didn't require performance to be safe in. Roga didn't know it yet, but something in Cattle Creek had just quietly, irreversibly begun. In the weeks after the social, Roga found reasons to visit the chophouse that even he knew were thin as tracing paper. Supper, mostly. Sometimes just coffee, drunk slow at the counter while Beth sat beside him working through a bowl of stew with more appetite than she'd shown in months. He told himself he was only trying to understand what had reached his daughter, the way a man studies a well after finding water where he expected stone. What he found was a woman who never once asked about his land. Loretta Pierce, on her visits, could recite the approximate acreage of the Circle H to the nearest quarter section. Miss Adeline Frost had once asked, with practiced lightness, how many head of cattle a man of his standing might run in a good year. But Mary asked whether the frost had gotten into his wheat seed, whether Beth preferred her cornbread crumbly or dense, whether he'd had any luck keeping the coyotes off his spring calves. Small things. Real things. The kind of questions a person asks when they are actually listening, not counting. The wealthy suitors, meanwhile, had not slowed their campaign. If anything, Beth's disappearance and reappearance at the social had sharpened it, as though the town's collective attention had become a resource to be mined. Loretta hired a photographer from Laramie under the guise of documenting the church's new bell, then arranged, with elaborate casualness, for Roga and Beth to be swept into a candid family portrait that took the better part of an afternoon, and no small amount of Roga's patience to escape. Miss Adeline Frost, not to be outdone, quietly paid off the remainder of the church's mortgage and made certain Reverend Cole knew whose name to speak aloud from the pulpit that Sunday, her eyes finding Roga's pew before the Reverend had even finished the sentence. Mary did none of this. In fact, the more Roga watched her, the more he began to suspect she was doing something closer to the opposite, that her plainness with him wasn't humility so much as avoidance, a door she kept carefully shut. He got a glimpse of why one evening, when he lingered past closing and overheard, through the thin wall between the kitchen and the storeroom, Mary speaking with Sister Odell, the old midwife who delivered half the children in Cattle Creek and had appointed herself something like an aunt to Mary since her father's passing. You watch him the way a woman watches rain she can't afford to hope for, Sister Odell said. I don't watch him, Mary answered, too quickly. Girl, I've known you since you were knee-high. Don't lie to an old woman who's seen you cry over a dead chicken. A long silence. Then Mary's voice quieter. You remember what happened with Elias? I remember. Everyone in this town watched him leave me standing at that altar for the Whitfield girl's dowry, and everyone in this town whispered afterward that I should have seen it coming, that I'd been reaching too high for a poor girl to reach. I won't have that said again. I won't have anyone look at me sitting across from Rogar Hensley and think I finally learned how to reach properly. Her voice caught, just slightly, on the last word. So I don't reach, not even when I want to. Roga stepped back from the wall that night and walked home under a sky without a single cloud, turning her words over like a stone he couldn't put down. The occasion to understand her fully came sooner than he wanted, and through harder means. A banknote on the Circle H came due at the worst possible time, forcing Roga into a 3-day cattle drive to Fort Laramie to meet a buyer, the kind of trip that revealed, to anyone paying attention, that the largest rancher in 3 counties was land-rich and cash-thin, a man whose wealth was mostly promises tied up in fence and hoof. He left Beth with the housekeeper and rode out at first light. By the second day, Beth had taken a fever. It was not, by the doctor's word, anything monstrous, a hard fever, the kind that comes on fast in small children and frightens more than it endangers, provided someone stays close and keeps it from climbing too high. But word of it spread through Cattle Creek the way word of illness always does, fast and soft-footed. And by that evening, the Hensley porch had become a small parade of concern. Loretta sent a bouquet and a card. Miss Adeline Frost sent her housemaid with a jar of soup and instructions to leave it at the door, since, as she told anyone who'd listen, fevers in children could be contagious, and a woman in her position couldn't risk her own health carelessly. Flowers arrived. Notes arrived, full of soft words and careful distance. Not one of them crossed the threshold. Mary closed the chophouse. She did not announce it, did not explain it to the handful of disappointed customers who found her door locked for 2 straight days, a real cost to a woman whose ledger could not spare even one day's earnings, let alone 2. She simply gathered what Sister Odell had taught her of nursing fevers years ago, walked to the Hensley house with a basket of cool cloths and broth, and sat. She stayed through that night and the next, spooning broth between Beth's cracked lips, laying cool cloths against her small forehead, humming, without quite realizing she'd picked it up, the same tune Beth herself hummed, the one that had first drawn the girl into her kitchen. Rogar rode in past midnight on the 3rd day, dust-caked and half-sick with worry, and found his front room dim and quiet. In the chair beside Beth's bed, Mary had fallen asleep sitting upright, her hand still resting where Beth's small fingers had curled around it in her sleep, the fever broken, the child's breathing slow, and even at last. He stood in the doorway a long time before he trusted himself to move. Rogar did not wake her that night. He simply pulled a second chair beside the first and sat until dawn came gray through the east window, watching his daughter breathe easy for the first time in 3 days, and watching the woman who had made it so. In the days that followed, once Beth was steady enough to sit up and ask, in words, actual words, more of them than she'd strung together in 3 years, for a second helping of broth, Rogar tried to do what any man of his standing would think to do. He rode to the chophouse with an envelope of money folded thick enough to cover her back debts twice over. He offered to send men to fix her roof, to replace the leaning porch post, to buy her a sound mule to replace poor limping buttons. Mary looked at the envelope on the counter between them like it was a coiled snake. "I didn't sit with her for payment," she said. "I know that. This isn't payment. It's gratitude. Money doesn't know the difference between the two, Mr. Hensley. It spends the same either way." She slid the envelope back toward him, gentle but immovable as a fence post. "If I take it, then every woman in this town who's been leaving flowers on your porch gets to say I was cleverer than them. That's all. That I found a better way to reach for what they were reaching for. I won't have that said. Not for any amount." He rode home with the envelope still in his coat pocket, and it took him the better part of a week to understand what she'd actually told him. It wasn't only that Mary refused to be paid. It was that in all the days since Beth's fever broke, while the whole town buzzed with the story of the poor chophouse woman who'd nursed the rancher's daughter through the night, Mary herself had said almost nothing about it. When Sister Odell tried to praise her at the mercantile, Mary changed the subject to the price of flour. When Reverend Cole made a small, well-meaning mention of her from the pulpit, she'd left the church red-faced and mortified rather than pleased. She wasn't merely refusing reward. She was actively fleeing credit, as though the two were the same danger, wearing different coats. That was the thing none of the others could have done, Rogar realized, even if they tried. Loretta's kindness needed an audience the way a fire needs air. Adeline's generosity needed a pulpit and a name spoken aloud. Their giving was built, brick by brick, to be seen, and there was nothing false in that exactly, only nothing free in it either. Mary's giving had no architecture at all. It simply happened, in rooms with no one watching, and then it tried to disappear. So Rogar did not go back with more money, and he did not go back with a speech. He went back with his tools. He waited for a morning when he knew Mary would be out delivering a basket to the Whitfield family. Old habits of hers, quiet errands nobody assigned her. And he climbed onto the chophouse roof himself, in his own shirt sleeves, and spent the better part of the day replacing the rotted shingles that had been letting rain into her kitchen for 2 winters running. He didn't leave a note. He didn't send word ahead. He simply did the thing that needed doing, in the language she herself had been speaking all along, the language of quiet hands and no audience. Mary came home at dusk to find him still up there, hammer in hand, sawdust in his hair, and for a long moment she only stood in the yard and looked at him the way a person looks at whether they'd stop believing in. "You didn't have to do that," she finally said. "Neither did you." He climbed down slow, and stood before her with none of the polish the other women had always dressed their courtship in, just a tired, dust-streaked rancher on a woman's porch. I've had women bring me flowers and photographs and church pews with my name attached. You brought my daughter her voice back, and then tried to hide from the credit of it. I couldn't figure for the longest while what I was supposed to do with that. Then I understood. You weren't asking me to do anything with it at all. You never were. Mary's composure, held so carefully for so long, finally gave. She told him then, plainly, without artifice, about Elias, the altar, the Whitfield dowry, the years of swallowing her own feeling rather than risk being mistaken, ever again, for a woman reaching after a man's wealth. "I've cared for you a long while," she admitted, quiet as a confession. "I stayed away because I couldn't bear to be counted among the others." "You were never among the others," Rogar said. "Every one of them showed me what they wanted me to see. You're the only one who showed me what I couldn't see at all, a girl who talks again. A house that felt warm without anybody spending a dime to make it seem so." There was no grand proposal that evening, no crowd, no photographer from Laramie. Months later, they were married plainly at the county clerk's office, with Sister Odell as witness and Beth clutching a fistful of wildflowers she'd picked herself. The wealthy suitors, in time, drifted on to court ranchers in other towns, remembered afterward, when they were remembered at all, as the women who'd wanted the house. Mary was remembered differently, the one who was already home before anyone thought to look for her there. On Sunday mornings, Beth baked bread beside her at the chophouse counter, talking freely now, humming sometimes without meaning to. And Rogar sat where he always had, an ordinary stool, an ordinary plate, paying full price, because Mary, even now, would not let him do otherwise. His true wealth, he'd come to understand, had never once appeared in any ledger he kept for cattle. It had been sitting behind a chophouse counter all along, uncounted, and unclaimed by anyone who thought to buy it.